अस्सलामुअलैकुम, दिस इज मोईद पिर्ज़ादा इन वाशिंगटन, यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स। मुझे कहीं पर भी अपना व्लॉग किए हुए तकरीबन 30 घंटे से ज़्यादा हो चुके हैं। आप में से बहुत से लोग सोच रहे होंगे कि एक ऐसे वक्त में जब लोग दिन में 2-2, 3-3 व्लॉग्स कर रहे हैं, इतनी डेवलपमेंट्स हो रही हैं, तो डॉक्टर मोईद पिर्ज़ादा जो है वो कहाँ गुम हो गए। मैं गुम कहीं नहीं हुआ। मैं मसलसल इन 30 घंटों में ये समझने की कोशिश कर रहा था कि पाकिस्तान की जो इन्वॉल्वमेंट सामने आई है, जिसका पाकिस्तान ने क्लेम किया है और अब उसे इंटरनेशनल मीडिया ने भी किसी तरह से एक्नॉलेज कर लिया है शहबाज शरीफ साहब के ट्वीट्स के बाद, इसकी हकीकत क्या है उसके लिए मैं मसलसल पढ़ रहा था, रिसर्च कर रहा था, देख रहा था, सुन रहा था, लोगों से बात कर रहा था और ख़ास करके सुन रहा था कि अमेरिका के अंदर से जो मुख्तलिफ सोशल मीडिया पंडित्स हैं, पॉडकास्टर्स हैं, वो इस डेवलपमेंट को कैसे देखते हैं। अब पाकिस्तान के अंदर सूरत हाल ये है कि इसके एक बहुत बड़ी अचीवमेंट के तौर पे देखा जा रहा है। पाकिस्तान के तमाम अखबारात में बताया जा रहा है, बाकायदा इस तरह की बातें लिखी जा रही हैं कि जैसे अल्लाह ही है जो किसी को इज्जत दे और जिल्लत दे, लोग जलते हैं वगैरह वगैरह। इशारा ये है कि जनरल आसिम मुनीर को एक दफ़ा फिर अल्लाह ने बहुत इज्जत दी है और वो अब दुनिया का एक बहुत बड़ा मसला हल करने चले। डोनाल्ड ट्रंप और ईरान के दरमियान में वो सुलह करवा रहे हैं। शहबाज शरीफ साहब का जो ट्वीट है, इस बात को बहुत ज़्यादा तकवीत उस वक्त मिल गई। पहले तो इंटरनेशनल मीडिया ने इसे को बहुत ज़्यादा रिपोर्ट नहीं किया। इसे शुरू में फाइनेंशियल टाइम्स ने, एफटी ने, जो यूरोप का एक बहुत बड़ा पेपर है, उससे रिपोर्ट किया था। इसराइल के एक पेपर ने इससे रिपोर्ट किया था और ज़्यादातर इसको सोशल मीडिया ने एब्जॉर्ब नहीं किया था। ना ही इसका कोई बहुत ज़्यादा जिक्र आपको जो बड़े बड़े अखबार हैं अमेरिका के उसमें नहीं था। लेकिन अब तकरीबन कोई भी पब्लिकेशन ऐसी नहीं है जो ईरान पे रिपोर्ट कर रही है, ईरान यूएस मैटर्स पे रिपोर्ट कर रही है और वो ये रिपोर्ट नहीं कर रही कि पाकिस्तान जो है उसने डोनाल्ड ट्रंप का एक 15 नुकाती प्रपोजल जो है वो ईरान तक पहुंचाया है। ये भी है कि ईरान के एक जो स्पोक्स पर्सन है, उन्होंने कंफर्म किया, उन्होंने पाकिस्तान का नाम तो नहीं लिया, उन्होंने ये कंफर्म किया है कि फ्रेंडली कंट्रीज या इंटरसीडिंग कंट्रीज जो हैं बहुत से, उनकी तरफ से अमेरिका के प्रपोजल मिल रहे हैं और एज पर दी पॉलिसी एंड पोजीशन ऑफ ईरान, जो ईरान की पोजीशन है उसके हिसाब से उनका जवाब भी दिया जा रहा है। ताहम इस चीज़ ने एक बहुत बड़ी हकीकत अख्तियार कर ली जब पाकिस्तान के प्राइम मिनिस्टर शहबाज शरीफ साहब ने इस हवाले से ट्वीट किया और उन्होंने कहा कि पाकिस्तान जो है वो होस्ट प्ले करेगा, उसका एक प्रिविलेज होगा ईरान और अमेरिका के दरमियान में बातचीत करवाने के लिए और हम हमेशा इसके लिए हमारा ये प्रिविलेज होगा। और उसमें उन्होंने एक बड़ी अनयूजुअल चीज़ की, उसमें उन्होंने टैग किया अमेरिका के सदर डोनाल्ड ट्रंप को, उन्होंने टैग किया डॉक्टर अब्बास अरगची को जो ईरान के फॉरेन मिनिस्टर हैं, उन्होंने टैग किया स्टीव विटकॉफ को जो कि सीनियर एनवॉय हैं डोनाल्ड ट्रंप के मशरक़े वस्ता के लिए। और उसके बाद उनके उस ट्वीट को डोनाल्ड ट्रंप ने ट्रूथ सोशल के ऊपर रिप्रोड्यूस किया। उसके बाद फिर जाहिर है ये मुमकिन नहीं था कि अमेरिकन मीडिया के लिए कि इस चीज़ को इग्नोर करते और सब ने बाकायदा आप कह लें कि पैराग्राफ लिखे हैं पाकिस्तान के इस मुमकिन रोल के हवाले से। लेकिन वो सारी की सारी इन्फॉर्मेशन एक ही तरह की है, चूँकि वो अल्टीमेटली पाकिस्तानी सोर्सेज ही को कोट करते हैं, उनका खुद से इसके बारे में कोई व्यू जो है वो नहीं है। पाकिस्तान में मैं देख रहा था कि पाकिस्तान के अंदर जैसे डॉन अखबार है, पाकिस्तान का बड़ा अखबार है, इसी तरह पाकिस्तान के उलेमा, पाकिस्तान के बहुत से समाजी हल्के लीडर्स जो हैं वो कह रहे हैं कि बस फौरी तौर पर सीज़ फायर जो है वो हो जाना चाहिए। बाज़ जगहों पर मैंने पढ़ा कि ईद उल अज़हा तक कम से कम सीज़ फायर हो जाना चाहिए, तक दरमियान में सोचने का मौका मिले। ये तमाम लोग, पाकिस्तान में मासूमियत बहुत ज़्यादा पाई जाती है, बेवकूफ़ी, जहालत और मासूमियत मिलते जुलते किस्म के हैं स्टेट ऑफ माइंड्स होती हैं। यानी सीज़ फायर तो 3 दिन के बाद ही मुमकिन था जब अमेरिका ने 28 फरवरी को ईरान के ऊपर हमला किया और आयतुल्लाह अली खामेनेई जो है उन्हें शहीद कर दिया, उनकी टॉप मिलिट्री IRGC की लीडरशिप को टारगेट किया, बहुत से लोगों को, मतलब सैकड़ों लोगों को मार डाला पहले 3 दिन में। तो उसके बाद अमेरिका और इजराइल, अमेरिका का खास करके था कि बस हमारी तरफ से बहुत हो गई और ये एटीट्यूड उनका बिल्कुल ऐसा था जैसा मुझे बहुत पहले, मुद्दतों पहले मैंने एक फिल्म देखी, एक बड़ी क्लासिकल फिल्म थी, इंग्लिश में थी, द बैंडेड क्वीन के हवाले से, जिसमें वो फुलन देवी के ऊपर बनी हुई फिल्म थी, जिसमें एक बड़ा खौफनाक सीन होता है, एक बड़ा ट्रेजिक सीन होता है, जिसमें पूरे गांव के जो अपर जाति के, ऊंची जाति के लोग हैं वो रेप करते हैं फुलन देवी का। 1 बाय 1 दिखाते हैं, एक एक आदमी आता है वो उसका रेप करता है और फिर वहां से निकलते हुए उसको कहते हैं कि बस तेरे साथ बहुत हो गई है, अब दोबारा ना ऐसा करना, यानी बदतमीजी ना करना, ये वॉट एवर। मुझे याद नहीं है उसने क्या किया था, लेकिन उसको एक कलेक्टिव पनिशमेंट दी जाती। तो अमेरिका के साथ डोनाल्ड ट्रंप का जो एटीट्यूड था ईरान के साथ, वो 2-2.5 दिन के बाद एग्जैक्टली यही था कि हमने बस ईरान को तबाह कर दिया, टॉप लीडरशिप मार दी है, रजीम चेंज हो गया, अब हम सीज फायर करना चाहते हैं। और इसके लिए उस वक्त ओमान के जरिए भी कम्युनिकेशन हुई थी, लेकिन ईरान ने उसका कोई जवाब नहीं दिया था। उसके बाद ये बात छपती रही कि ईरान ने कहा है कि सीज फायर नहीं होगा अब तो, जब तक ईरान को गारंटीज चाहिए। और ईरान की गारंटीज मजीद भी मैं जिक्र करता रहूंगा, लेकिन ईरान की प्रिंसिपल गारंटी और एश्योरेंस तो ये है कि ये जो मजाक बना लिया अमेरिका और इजराइल ने, जून 2025 में हमला कर दिया, 12 दिन की जंग हुई, उसके बाद उस जंग को इन्होंने खत्म किया, ईरान ने उस जंग को खत्म नहीं किया। यूनिलैटरली सीज फायर किया अमेरिका ने ईरान के न्यूक्लियर रिएक्टर्स को तबाह करके, और फिर इसराइल ने जंग बंद कर दी, और जब इसराइल ने भी जंग बंद कर दी, अमेरिका ने भी जंग बंद कर दी, तो ईरान ने जंग बंद कर दी। ये और बात है कि बाद में ईरानियन लीडरशिप ने उसका जब तज्जिया किया, एनालिसिस किया तमाम लेवल्स के ऊपर इंक्लूडिंग आयतुल्लाह अली खामेनी, तो इस नतीजे में पहुंचे कि उन्हें उस वक्त सीज फायर नहीं करना चाहिए था, बिकॉज इन दोनों बदमाशों ने अपने टर्म्स एंड कंडीशन के ऊपर जंग शुरू की बगैर किसी वजह के, अपने मकासद हासिल करने के लिए, और उसके बाद इन्होंने जंग बंद कर दी जब ये थक गए, जब इनका असला खत्म हो गया, इनके इंटरसेप्टर्स की शॉर्टेज हो गई थी, और ईरान को चाहिए था कि उस स्टेज के ऊपर जंग बंद ना करता। तो पाकिस्तान में जहां और भी हजारों किस्म की बेवकूफ़ियां पाई जाती हैं, वहां जितना भी नैरेटिव जो है वो ईरान इराक जंग के बारे में लिखा जा रहा है, वो मायूस कुन हद तक चाइल्डिश है, बेवकूफ़ी पे मबनी है, उसमें किसी किस्म की कोई अंडरस्टैंडिंग नहीं है। और उसे देख के एक पाकिस्तानी की हैसियत से जो अमेरिका के अंदर वाशिंगटन में है और यहाँ दुनिया के तमाम ज़राए को पढ़ रहा है, देख रहा है, रिसर्च कर रहा है, लोगों को सुन रहा है, और अमेरिका में बहुत बेहतर ओपिनियन पाई जाती है इस जंग के खिलाफ। और अमेरिका की तकरीबन 60-70% जो पॉपुलेशन है, सर्वे आफ्टर सर्वे आ रहा है, वो इस जंग के खिलाफ है। तो जो पाकिस्तान से पर्सपेक्टिव आ रहा है वो मायूस कुन है। अब मैं ये सारा कुछ क्यों आपको एक्सप्लेन कर रहा हूँ, मैं भी आपको बताता हूँ, बिकॉज मैंने एक इंटरव्यू किया है, और ये उस इंटरव्यू के हवाले से मैं थोड़ा सा बैकग्राउंड आपको दे रहा हूँ कि वाशिंगटन से इस पूरी सूरत हाल को कैसे देखा जा रहा है, और डोनाल्ड ट्रंप अमेरिका के सदर की स्टेट ऑफ माइंड क्या है, वो कितने घबराए हुए हैं, उनके ऊपर किस किस्म का प्रेशर है। इस हवाले से मैंने एक डिस्कशन की, बहुत लंबी, 1 घंटे से ज़्यादा तवालत की, एरिक स्पर्लिंग के साथ, जो एग्जीक्यूटिव डायरेक्टर हैं जस्ट फॉरेन पॉलिसी के, और वो वाशिंगटन के एक इनसाइडर हैं जिनका वाशिंगटन के अंदर जो ऑफिस है वो कांग्रेस की बिल्डिंग के बिल्कुल सामने है, और वो कांग्रेस में जो कुछ होता है वहाँ जो भी बात हो रही होती है, क्योंकि कांग्रेस में 2 दफ़ा कोशिश की गई है सेनेट और हाउस में इस जंग को रुकवाने के लिए, और इस वक्त भी आज भी इसके हवाले से सेनेट में कोशिश की जा रही थी कि जंग को, क्योंकि अब चूंकि प्रेसिडेंट ने $200 बिलियन, पेंटागन ने एडिशनल $200 बिलियन मांगे हैं इस जंग के लिए, जबकि अमेरिका के डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ वॉर का जो सालाना बजट होता है वो $1 ट्रिलियन होता है, तो उसका 20% एडिशनल उनको चाहिए इस जंग के लिए। तो उसके हवाले से सेनेट में डिस्कशन भी हो रही थी, और एक बार फिर इसको रुकवाने की कोशिश भी थी। सेनेटर्स को एहसास है कि जंग रुक नहीं सकेगी, डेमोक्रेटिक सेनेटर्स को, क्योंकि रिपब्लिकन्स प्रेसिडेंट के साथ खड़े होंगे, लेकिन मकसद उनका यह था कि इश्यूज रेज किए जाएं, सवाल रेज किए जाएं, और बहुत ही धांसू किस्म की डिस्कशन यहाँ पे हो रही थी। इन तमाम चीज़ों से रिलेटेड मैंने एरिक स्पर्लिंग का एक इंटरव्यू किया। ये इंटरव्यू इंग्लिश में है, मैं इंग्लिश में ही इसे पोस्ट कर रहा हूँ, कुछ एडिशनल डॉक्यूमेंटेशन एंड विजुअलाइजेशन के साथ। इंग्लिश में इसलिए पोस्ट कर रहा हूँ कि इससे पहले हमने उर्दू में डब करके इसी चैनल के ऊपर GVS न्यूज़ पे हमने इंग्लिश के इंटरव्यूज रखे। उसके बाद मैंने देखा कि दर्जनों लोगों ने ये कमेंट किया कि एक्चुअल इंग्लिश का डिस्कशन कहाँ पे है, बिकॉज उनको महसूस होता है कि जो डब्ड लैंग्वेज है उसमें वो मज़ा उनको नहीं आता, वो एक्चुअल लैंग्वेज, एक्चुअल हरकत, सकनात, फीलिंग और जो वर्बोसिटी होती है या अल्फाज होते हैं उनको सुनना चाहते हैं। दूसरी ऑप्शन ये हो सकती है कि आप इंग्लिश में हैं और उसको उर्दू में सबटाइटल कर दें, लेकिन यकीन माने वो बहुत महंगा पड़ता है, बिकॉज उसमें एक ह्यूमन रिसोर्स को मसलसल काम करना पड़ता है। उसको आप पहले किसी ऐप से ट्रांसलेट करते हैं, फिर उसको आपको लाइन बाय लाइन उसके ऊपर लगाना पड़ता है, तो वो बहुत ज़्यादा, मेरे पास इतनी ह्यूमन रिसोर्स, इतने रिसोर्सेज नहीं है कि मैं वैसे कर सकूं। तो मेरी आप लोगों से रिक्वेस्ट है कि आप इसे इंग्लिश में देखें, समझें, इसको जितनी देर तक देखना चाहते हैं देखें। ये एक ऐसी डिस्कशन है जिसमें बहुत ज़्यादा ज़ेरो बम है, ये एक स्ट्रक्चर से नहीं चलती, इसीलिए मैं शुरू में इसका एक दिबाचा या प्रेफेस आपके सामने रख रहा हूँ। ये इस तरह से स्ट्रक्चर नहीं है कि एक पॉइंट 1 से A to B to C to Z चलती नहीं है। ये डिस्कशन मसलसल कभी अमेरिकन पॉलिटिक्स के अंदर आती है, कभी डोनाल्ड ट्रंप के ऊपर आती है, कभी उनके स्टेट ऑफ माइंड पे आती है, कभी अमेरिका के इंटरेस्ट पे आती है, कभी इसराइल के इंटरेस्ट के ऊपर आती है, कभी इसराइल और अमेरिका के दरमियान जो डाइवर्जेंस है उसमें आती है, ईरान को कैसे नाहक टारगेट किया है उस पर आती है, मीडिया के अंदर किस किस्म के तासुरात हैं, अमेरिकन जो मेन स्ट्रीम मीडिया है उसका कितना बुरा रोल है, कैसे वो तमाम जंगों के लिए जिम्मेदार है। कभी भी इस किस्म की जंगें जो अमेरिका ने की हैं दुनिया के खिलाफ, ये ना होती अगर अमेरिका का मीडिया सुलझा होता, अगर आज़ाद होता मेन स्ट्रीम मीडिया। अब अमेरिका में इस वक्त क्राइसिस इसलिए खड़ा हो गया है वॉर की लॉबी को कि अमेरिका में भी पाकिस्तान की तरह जो सोशल मीडिया है, अमेरिका का फर्क सिर्फ इतना है कि अमेरिका के सोशल मीडिया के जितने भी पंडित्स हैं वो सब अमेरिका के अंदर रहते हैं। पाकिस्तान में प्रॉब्लम है कि वो तमाम लोग जो बोलते हैं पाकिस्तान की सियासत के ऊपर, जो सच बोलते हैं, जो एक अपना एक ऑनेस्ट और सिंसियर एनालिसिस देने की कोशिश करते हैं, वो या तो अमेरिका में है या कनाडा के अंदर है या बरतानिया में है या ऑस्ट्रेलिया में है या कहीं न्यूजीलैंड में है या कहीं और बैठे हुए हैं या जर्मनी में है। वो पाकिस्तान के अंदर नहीं है। पाकिस्तान के अंदर पाकिस्तान की फ़ौज ये इंश्योर करती है कि कोई भी आदमी सच ना बोल सके। जिस तरह के इस वक़्त ये जो पाकिस्तान की पीस एफ़र्ट्स हैं, उनको जिस शक्ल में दिखाया जा रहा है, वहाँ से उसको सिर्फ़ शादियाने बजाए जा रहे हैं, उसमें पाकिस्तान के रोल को बहुत मैग्नीफाई करके बताया जा रहा है, लेकिन उसको इस तरह से प्रेज़ेंट किया जा रहा है कि लोग असल हकीकतों को नहीं समझ सकते। तो ये एरिक स्पर्लिंग के साथ जो डिस्कशन है, ये बहुत हद तक आपको असल हकीकतों को समझने में मदद मिलेगी। फिर आपके ज़हन में क्वेश्चन पैदा होगा कि पाकिस्तान के आर्मी चीफ, पाकिस्तान की आर्मी जो है, वो डोनाल्ड ट्रंप की मदद कर रही है, ईरान की मदद कर रही है, दोनों की मदद कर रही है, दुनिया की मदद कर रही है। ये सिर्फ और सिर्फ डोनाल्ड ट्रंप की हिकमत अमली के अंदर एक रोल जो है वो प्ले कर रही है। और बातें पाकिस्तान में जो मैंने देखी वो की जा रही हैं कि हमने हमेशा ही मीडिएशन का रोल प्ले किया। हमने ईरान, हमने चीन और अमेरिका के दरमियान में भी जो है तमाम की तमाम जो हमने नेगोशिएशन करवाई थी, जिसके नतीजे में चाइना की ग्रेट ओपनिंग हुई थी, वो भी हमने करवाई थी। हमने अभी अफगानिस्तान में तालिबान और अमेरिका के दरमियान में दोहा पीस प्रोसेस भी हमने करवाया। फिर हमने पता नहीं और भी क्या कुछ किया, ईरान और सऊदी अरब के दरमियान में हमने करवाया था। डेफिनेटली तौर पे पाकिस्तान को ये रोल प्ले करना चाहिए था, लेकिन जो क्रिटिकल क्वेश्चन है, क्या इस वक्त पाकिस्तान वो रोल प्ले कर रहा है जो पाकिस्तान में लोग समझते हैं कि रोल प्ले कर रहा है, या जो कहा जा रहा है कि रोल प्ले कर रहा है? तो ये एरिक स्पर्लिंग का इंटरव्यू मैं चाहता हूं कि आप देखें, और ये मेरे इंग्लिश चैनल के ऊपर भी होगा। वहाँ ये इसका उर्दू में दिबाचा या प्रेफेस नहीं होगा, लेकिन वहाँ पर बहुत जल्दी मैं इंग्लिश चैनल की तवज्जो इसलिए भी आपकी तरफ दिलाना चाहता हूँ कि आप में से बहुत से लोग जो अंग्रेजी से नफरत नहीं करते, अंग्रेजी को समझ सकते हैं, जिन्होंने अभी भी आइकॉनोक्लास्ट मल्टीमीडिया विद मोईद पिरज़ादा ज्वाइन नहीं किया, मैं उसका इमेज, उसका लिंक यहाँ पे आपको दिखाता हूँ, और उसको शेयर भी कर दूंगा इसकी डिस्क्रिप्शन के अंदर, टॉप पिन कमेंट में कर दूंगा। उसे ज्वाइन करें, बिकॉज अब आने वाले दिनों में आप समझें कि अगले 24 घंटे के बाद से मैं बहुत सी ऐसी डिस्कशंस जिनका ताल्लुक ईरान, इसराइल, अमेरिका, मशरक़ वस्ता, मुस्लिम वर्ल्ड की सियासत से है, और इस किस्म के जो इंपॉर्टेंट इशूज़ हैं ग्लोबल, उनको मैं वहाँ पे प्लेस करूंगा। आपको रोज़ ही हर 24 घंटे के बाद, आप समझें 24-36 घंटे के बाद आपको वहाँ पे नया कंटेंट मिलेगा, तो आप उसे ज्वाइन करें। अभी देखिए एरिक स्पर्लिंग को, और मुझे आपके कमेंट्स का इंतजार रहेगा।
United States president is being helped by Pakistan to end this war with Iran, and no one is really sure what's going to happen in the next 5 days. What can this negotiation via Pakistan at this stage give Donald Trump, that Donald Trump can sell to his base and say that, look, I have achieved something out of this disastrous war?
You know, right now they have the U.S. and Israel in a pretty tough position with the interceptors likely running low. Nobody knows how many interceptors the U.S. has. You know, Iran is not going to be able to stop this war without major concessions that ensure that it can rebuild and protect itself. These guarantees look like it's not easy. You know, it's not an easy thing to really guarantee, you know, but I think without question, the Russian and Chinese would have to be involved. You know, the U.S. completely has total control over Israeli military, logistics, you know, huge parts of the intel. Israel's military cannot function without explicit U.S. approvals. There are a lot of Democrats who, you know, see this war as a political disaster for Trump and a really good opportunity for Democrats in the midterm. We want Trump to do whatever he can to make a deal and get out. Stop the killing, Iranian civilians, Iranian society.
So even if the Trump wants to strike a deal, say, with Iranians, I mean, hypothetically, what would Netanyahu do?
And it's a time to put partisan politics aside, because the global economy is hanging in the balance. I think this Iran war is such a strategic nightmare for the United States. It's a gift, you know, unfortunately for the neocons, it's a gift to Russia and China.
What's the importance of that, J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio being part of the negotiation?
Well, J.D. and Marco, they say they're friendly, but they represent totally opposite sides of the Republican foreign policy spectrum.
Do you fear that Israel at some point is going to use the nuclear weapons against someone?
Yeah, I think everyone fears that at this point.
Assalamu alaikum to all. This is MOEED PIRZADA. Joining me is ERIK SPERLING, Executive Director of the Just Foreign Policy. ERIK is someone who had been warning me several weeks in advance that the war is coming on Iran. And he had been continuously sending text messages and emails that we need to basically rally the Congress in support of the legislation which Congressman Rouhani and Thomas Macy were bringing to stop the war, to put some kind of break on the whole thing, and the war is coming. And at that time, you know, I thought that some sort of resolution will be found. But here we are, everyone is in trouble. Now, momentarily, the United States president is being helped by Pakistan to end this war with Iran, and no one is really sure what's going to happen in the next 5 days. ERIK, how are you looking at the situation now?
Yeah, well, it's obviously there's a lot of aspects to this, but it's been very interesting to see that the regime of Asim Munir and all of the civilian people working under him have found a newfound relevance because of this conflict. So, we know that those few people over in Islamabad are feeling very excited that they get to play a useful role. Given that from what I could tell, they didn't have much else to offer the West. So, I think they're a short-term a winner in this, but we know that won't last long. But if they can,
will they be able to offer any constructive role?
It is theoretically possible that despite how corrupt they are, how hated they are from their own people, that they do potentially still have a little bit more cultural and historical awareness than the Trump administration in particular. That's not a very high bar, obviously. So I think that's possible, and so as much as we've, been disappointed that the U.S. has, been basically exclusively responsible for propping up this regime, I do hope they could play a positive role here. And if they do that, they might end up seeing a little bit more, at least some mild appreciation from people. But I think everyone could imagine if you had a democratically elected leader like Imran Khan in that role, I think anyone who follows the country would say, this war, it could have been very likely to even avoid this war or even, limit Gaza with a voice like that, which unfortunately is exactly why the U.S. Prefers him to not be there.
So let's actually look at, that's a very important point. I'll come to it later. But let's look at the perspective and the interest of the both sides, the Donald Trump and the Iran and Pakistan. Pakistan, I believe, knowing a bit about the Pakistani politics, that their goal is a prestige in the local politics. If they end up playing a role, any kind of role, in fact, the mere fact that they're being seen as playing a role really helps them in the Pakistani politics. It gives them a regional prestige at all, even if it fails. But Donald Trump had almost got a deal in Geneva when Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner met through the Omani foreign minister and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And Iranians, as we now know very clearly, not only because of the Oman foreign minister, but also because of Jonathan Powell, the British National NSA, that Iranians came up with the kind of proposals which the British were not expecting. And Iranians were prepared to guarantee the end of the weapons program. They were prepared to dilute the uranium. They were prepared to not only dilute, but also transfer the enriched uranium to a third country, not United States, but Russia. And they were prepared to go beyond this. But Donald Trump didn't stop at that, and then the war started. So what can this negotiation via Pakistan at this stage give Donald Trump that Donald Trump can sell to his base and say that, look, I have achieved something out of this disastrous war?
Yeah, well, this is exactly, this type of question is only just now coming into even the earliest focus, because the reality is the way that Iran was forced into, essentially what you could call, its most aggressive, or kind of call it the nuclear option, for lack of a better term here, is, by shutting down the Hormuz Strait. They really need to get some major concessions here to ensure that Israel and the U.S. won't return and attack again. Right now they have the U.S. and Israel in a pretty tough position with the interceptors likely running low. Nobody knows how many interceptors the U.S. has, and at the same time knows how many missiles and drones and launchers Iran has. But that's essentially the unknowable question. And so, Iran is not going to be able to stop this war without major concessions that ensure that it can rebuild and protect itself. So, it's going to be very, very difficult. If Trump had very creative diplomats now, he would be able to find a way to, make a major deal with them that gives them these concessions while, getting them to agree to some face-saving measures for him. But the reality is he's in an incredibly difficult place. Iran, has the total ability to plunge the U.S. and global economy into a depression at pretty much any time it wants at this point. And so it's very limited options.
But Eric, so far, as I see it, the Pakistani military has helped Donald Trump, because if Donald Trump had gone ahead at 7:45 p.m. U.S. time on Monday and had actually knocked out an Iranian power plant, Iranians would have definitely knocked out one of the biggest power plants either in Saudi Arabia or in Qatar or UAE. And I thought they would probably target Dubai or something like this, right? And then Donald Trump would not have been left with any more options, right? I mean, once the GCC power plant had gone or a desalination plant had gone, Donald Trump was dead. I mean, in terms, he was dead in the tracks. So the Pakistani military has been of great help to Donald Trump by actually, giving him an off-ramp for 5 days at least, right? But Iranians, on the other hand, I mean, Israel has not stopped degrading Iran's infrastructure. And they're continuing chasing Iranian missile batteries and the system and everything. So what has Iran got out of it right now?
Well, Iran's got a huge amount out of it in the sense that, they've obviously taken horrific losses. We don't know the full extent. I mean, U.S. is saying, 8,000. They may have even said 9,000 targets were hit. We know, so we could get into the scale of the horrific destruction that Iran has dealt with. Definitely, it's widely reported in the mainstream press that a new generation of Iranians who did like the West and were, generally disinclined to support the regime, if you will, there, now sees that the U.S. and Israel are on another level of depravity and just extreme, lack of care for Iran or its people. So that's been one thing it gained is I think it's, they've really been able to show that generation who was that was becoming kind of more Western oriented culturally, just what the West, how the West treats that region. Other than that, I mean, the main thing they have is they were forced into the option that they wanted to avoid at all costs, which is shutting down the Hormuz and, beginning to up that escalation ladder of striking various facilities. And so what they've gained is they have a huge amount of leverage. And I think all experts agree they're not going to give it up without major concessions that effectively, yes.
There's an optic of leverage. There's an optic of leverage that Donald Trump has sort of surrendered, but unless, as you said, that Iranians need solid assurances and guarantees that they will not face another war from United States and Israel. But Pakistanis cannot create a process in which such kind of guarantees and assurances can come. I don't see, unless Russians and Chinese are involved, who's going to give the guarantees?
Right. I mean, I've been talking with experts trying to think about what these guarantees look like. It's not easy. It's not an easy thing to really guarantee. But I think without question, the Russian and Chinese would have to be involved. And so it is an incredibly complex negotiation. It is actually in Trump's best interest to do it. That's what the interesting aspect is for him to make a deal that, finally, ensures peace with Iran. You could get a nuclear deal similar to JCPOA as part of this, but it also guarantees non-aggression with Iran. And then also bringing in Russia and China. There is a plausible path here that essentially makes peace with each of these countries. And so that is a plausible path, but whether, I think all of us are trying to understand what are Trump's motivations here. Why did he launch a war that totally ran counter to everything he campaigned on, everything that every expert thought about him, which was low energy prices, staying out of foreign wars. Why did he launch this war? This is one of the big mysteries. And, if we don't get an answer soon, it'll have to be for historians to study. But it's one of the biggest mysteries.
Why do you think the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu had such kind of control and influence on the American president? Well, he never had this kind of control on any U.S. president before.
Yeah, I mean, it's widely documented. I mean, there's an old article where I think it was, one of the previous Lebanon wars, and Biden just had to call and say it's over. It's over. You're done. No more. And Bibi had no choice. He just had to stop. The U.S. completely has total control over Israeli military logistics, huge parts of the intel. Israel's military cannot function without explicit U.S. approval, essentially. So the U.S. has complete control. I mean, if the U.S. wanted to tell the Israelis what color tie to wear each day of the week, they would have absolutely no option.
It's actually making me laugh is the fact that you say that U.S. has total control of Israeli military, intelligence, logistics, weapons, bombs, everything, finance, everything. But yet Israel ends up controlling the U.S. politics.
Well, that's, I think there's a mix there. I mean, it's really a U.S.-Israeli, national security establishment. There isn't really a place where it becomes Israeli or becomes American. It's one united group that shares the same ideology and outlook. And there's different factions within it. AIPAC lobby is just, essentially one of the ways that group can use to achieve their goals. But it's really a shared defense establishment that obviously has a lot of Israelis, but the Americans love Israel, just as much or more as those Israelis do. So, so all to say is, we don't know why Trump did this. It does raise, I think everyone who follows it raises the question of whether somebody does have something on him ultimately. He obviously has a long history of, he admitted publicly that he would go into the Miss Teen USA dressing room. This guy is not a guy who had a big resistance to extremely young, sexually, engaging with extremely young women or girls. So who knows what they have on him, but it's an unbelievable loss for America, obviously for Iran. But, I think from our perspective, we're still hoping that Republicans and Democrats who want peace would be trying to encourage him, cut your losses, make the peace deal now. It's not too late to kind of turn this around, reorient your attention back to whatever your domestic priorities are that are healthy, ideally.
I was hearing Professor John Mersheimer in Breaking Point. He said that while there's absolutely no proof, but he suspects that the Israelis the Zionists have something on Donald Trump. They're compelling him.
Yeah.
But there's another perspective. I don't know whether you heard of it or not, that there is a group of psychiatrists that has been campaigning from 2015, the clinical psychologist psychiatrists, who think that Donald Trump has a personality disorder, which is very similar to that of the Adolf Hitler. And this is malignant narcissism. And he's delusional. He doesn't understand the consequences. He doesn't feel for the others. He can do very strange things. He's deceptive, which you have seen. He doesn't feel for the kind of things he has done while negotiating and then attacking the countries. So, and there are some people who say that the president may find it, he's reached such a stage that he may find it difficult to complete his presidency the second time. Do you fear something like that happening?
Yeah, I think if you watch just clips from him just a few years ago, he was clearly much sharper. So that's a concern. But I would say, yeah, his style of governing, it really is like the typical American, kind of uneducated, callous American way of thinking about the world, where you just, if you grow up in America, as I did, kind of in the post 9/11 era, there really is this sense that, if you're not critical of it, you really get used to the idea that you just drone strike people, you just kill people. It really just becomes very, and if you're not, that's why sometimes these drone striking polls on drone strikes, polls on killing, they poll pretty, much higher than any healthy society would, because people have really gotten used to this idea that, well, if someone's a threat, you just assassinate them from the sky, and that's, at least there's no troops involved, So that's, I think, kind of, he's sort of a natural manifestation of that, in a form of someone who, is just a showman and has never been, reined in so it's incredibly troubling. I can't imagine what it looks like for the rest of the world. But I just hope they can see that, this system is not stable, but that when it can elect somebody like him, and that we need a more balanced world that doesn't rely on one country to dominate global affairs.
In the last 24 hours, 24 to 36 hours, Donald Trump has made some very interesting comments. He was standing on an airport talking to the reporters, and there was a question about the Strait of Hormuz. Then who's going to control the Strait of Hormuz? And he first says Ayatollahs. Then he corrects himself and says, maybe me, he points to, have you seen that clip?
Yeah.
He says me, he says jointly, me and whoever the Ayatollah will be. What is that? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think, he's realizing, what we all thought we had warned him about, and we thought he understood, which is that this war is guaranteed to ruin his presidency at best. And it's going to ruin his legacy as well. And now he's probably realizing that, he needs to get a way out of it. And the way to get out of it, unfortunately, is going to be significant concessions to Iran. So the kind of deal they're going to be able to accept is what hawks or neocons in the United States are going to call a U.S. defeat. So, it's like he doesn't seem maybe sophisticated enough to navigate this in a smart way. But so it's almost like he's floating these ideas that are, will kind of start to test the waters for like what is essentially going to look like a surrender if you're a far right pro-war person. And the rest of us will say whatever ends the war. We weren't. Iran is not a significant threat to any average American. I would say, slipping on ice is a much higher threat. Potholes are significantly higher threat. No one in Iran is not threatening any American. It's a threat to Israel somewhat. So all that to say is, I think he's, for most people would be totally happy to just see him make a deal and say, all right, I'm not talking about Iran for the rest of my presidency. That's the average American would think that. But he does have to contend with the neocons within his administration. And of course, the Israel, the U.S. Israel defense, that whole group of elites.
So I have a sense, I think I agree with you that he's floating ideas to make people realize that we're moving towards some sort of deal. Because in the last 24 hours, he has also said this thing. I saw it in the morning that they are offering us a huge thing, while referring that Iran is really making huge concessions. So we don't see Iran making huge concessions, except for the fact that he's going to rephrase the same thing which they were offering him in Geneva, and which was actually huge, because they were ready to give up. They will give solid guarantees that they're not going to develop a nuclear weapon, no weaponization program, no enrichment till 5 years, then low-grade enrichment. The 60% enriched uranium can be diluted and transferred to another country. So I think these are the concessions which Trump will now basically sell as huge concessions.
Yeah, that's the best case scenario. From our perspective as people who want peace, that's what we hope that he'll do. I work with the sole goal of promoting diplomacy, reducing conflict. But there are other people in Washington who have different motivations. There are a lot of Democrats who see this war as a political disaster for Trump and a really good opportunity for Democrats in the midterms. That's a very conscious, very common feeling, even if it's not even something people totally articulate consciously, just something they know from being a Democratic, operative, that this is going to be great for us in the midterm. So, I think from those of us who want peace, we want Trump to do whatever he can to make a deal and get out. Stop the killing. Iranian civilians, Iranian society. It's horrific to do this to the ancient civilization. These ancient civilizations are a treasure for humankind. Even if Americans don't care that a society has thousands of years of history, and it's objectively true. It's a cool thing. So it's horrific to think that we're destroying this society, harming its people for no reason at all. So all that to say is, I think we're hoping he'll do that, and then our work also as anti-war progressives, if you will, is to make sure the Democrats encourage him to go down that path. And they don't come and they hit him and say, you're so weak on Iran, I can't believe you made a deal. Because that is a line that you're going to see some Democrats take to try to opportunistically, get a political benefit from the deal.
It's very important to help him get out of it, actually.
That's what we're pushing. And we're trying to tell Democrats, if you're not helping him to get out of it, you are basically supporting the war. And it's a time to put partisan politics aside, because the global economy is hanging in the balance. And if there's an exchange where they start destroying all the oil and gas fields, we may not be able to, all of us might be impacted. And the poorest in the developing world, it's horrific to think about, but when people are just barely hanging on and you destroy the global economy, you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or more who perish, including children. So this is a horrific thing. It's, the fact that anyone will play partisan politics with it is a sign of the kind of the moral, spiritual decay of the country, unfortunately. But there are some of us here pushing people to, really keep perspective on this. And we have to help this very unwell, potentially, demented, potentially, mentally ill, potentially controlled by Israel lobby type guy. We have to help him get out of this. That's our task right now.
Many things, I understand that you have always been very unhappy with the mainstream legacy media, but many things were extremely disappointing. In January, even New York Times started writing that 60,000 people, 30,000 people have been killed by the Iranian government and the regime. And now when United States and Israel are saying that together they have done more than 16,000, it's almost like more than 17,000 airstrikes, and they're dropping 2,000-pound bombs on the coastline of Hormuz. They're dropping 5,000-pound bombs, and you can see the kind of devastation and destruction which they have in Iran. The figure that is being quoted in New York Times is 1,300 people have died in Iran. I mean, can you believe this shit? I mean, no, I think the Iranian government is hiding. I mean, if even one person has died per strike, then that means at least 16,000 people have died in Iran. But I think the actual death toll in Iran would be much, much higher. And for their own diplomatic reasons, the Iranian government is hiding the figures.
Yeah, you could see them doing that. It makes sense because you don't want to. It could, in theory, reduce your leverage if you're broadcasting that it's a mass killing. So I could see that. I mean, I'm not a military or propaganda strategist in that way, but I think there's no doubt from my mind that when the smoke clears and the rubble is uncovered, that and I felt this before the war too, that this was going to be one of the most brutal air campaigns in history. And I think, according to what they're saying, it sounds like they believe that it is too. And it's just horrific, and all for nothing. Because Iran, just to be clear, I mean, Iran obviously wasn't close to getting a nuclear weapon. They were happy to not get a nuclear weapon. But no serious person thinks Iran was ever going to use a nuclear weapon offensively, even if they got it. It's not a serious argument. Nobody intelligent argues that, because obviously that would mean national suicide. And the Persian people haven't committed national suicide all these millennia. Like, they're not going to start now, and nobody intelligent thinks they would. But nonetheless, people in Washington would say that. So it just gives you a sense of just how rotted out, like, the level of kind of intellectual debate that there is, in Washington, where I'm sitting. Unfortunately,
no intelligent person is going to say this, but I'm looking at a different picture. Had we didn't have the social media, we didn't have the YouTube, we didn't have the Twitter, what would we have found of this war? Because when you look at the mainstream CBS and you look at CNN, I mean, they're still basically saying the same kind of things. I mean, if you hear the analysts and the people on the CNN, they give you the idea that Iran was dangerous. Iran was, not only about to use the nuclear bombs against Israel, it would probably use a nuclear device against the United States. I mean, this kind of shit, which is totally stupid, which is totally unintelligent, can be so easily said on American mainstream media. What do you think of it?
It's been incredible because, one of the benefits of when Trump does these horrible things is that at least then Democrats feel pressure to criticize Trump. But even despite that, even if it's something they would kind of support generally, but despite that, we're seeing like MSNBC. I was just watching clips on MSNBC. They're having completely pro-war commentators on, and uncritically. I mean, it's really, I have a bunch of clips, which I'm actually going to post some of them. But, I think you're absolutely right. What a blessing that we have this growth in independent media. Obviously Pakistan, because of the regime and the censorship and the way that those old legacy channels were just, from what, I'm not an expert in it, but, they even as a casual observer, they come off as very, not very useful, let's say. And so you are obviously one of the main people leading this, and America is catching up to the Pakistanis in that way, with all the independent media, obviously Breaking Points, Drop Site as the print kind of online outlet. I mean, it's hard to even imagine where we would be right now without them. And it's just one of the things that can give us hope is that legacy media is definitely dying out, and so. More and more, we have freedom to help, expose the truth, shape dynamics even on Capitol Hill. We have journalists. DropSite has new journalists that are, asking members of Congress questions in person, which is helping already to shape vote outcomes. So, I do think we could get into, the broader trajectory. I think the broader trajectory is good. For the world. I think this Iran war is such a strategic nightmare for the United States. It's a gift, unfortunately for the neocons, it's a gift to Russia and China, and a major loss for U.S. hegemony, which is embarrassing for them. So,
I find the evolution of Tucker Carlson very interesting. How do you look at this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the evolution, not just him, but he's been part of it, and then also Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example. We was just talking to someone today. We were talking about how she was doubted her sincerity about the wars in and the U.S.-Israeli war in Gaza or not. And I think everyone agrees now she's genuine. She cares. She's shown she cares. She cares apparently and fights a lot more than in terms of her language and her spirit and her time spent on it than vast majority of Democratic members of Congress. So, we're seeing a lot of and then we have the resignation of Joe Kent. He sort of comes out of those similar circles of America first, non-interventionist types. And so, I think it's very promising. We definitely want to support those voices on the right. They're not perfect on all the issues that we might, from kind of our perspective is sort of an anti-imperialist, anti-war perspective. So they're not going to be perfect on all of them, but we do like. It's great to see such an explosion on the right of anti-war sentiment, and it just reflects how the American public is so overwhelmingly done with talking about foreign stuff. People sometimes say no more foreign aid, but what they really want is just stop talking about foreign places. Like just focus on the basics here. And that's really appropriate for a country that has such a horrible track record abroad. The best thing you can do is to just stay out because you have the worst track record of any country, really. So it's better to err on the side of staying out. So I think it's a very positive trend. I mean, but we just have to see how many people will be killed before we defeat this kind of endless war machine.
Did you get to see some clips of the Economist discussion with Tucker Carlson, the Economist editor?
Yes, I did.
I always had huge respect for Economist. I thought the Economist is a well-meaning intellectual institution. This discussion somehow or the other lowered the prestige of Economist editors in my eyes, because Tucker really exposed the editor in the sense that when she says that, she goes to Gaza and she thinks it's a huge loss for Israel. And he says, what are you talking of? I mean, he says, first of all, it's a loss for Israel. It's a loss for the Palestinians, This is the kind of mentality, So, I've suddenly started seeing Economist, one of the most powerful publication in the world, as a very right-wing, extreme right-wing, unsympathetic, insensitive publication.
Yeah, I've always, had issues with their reporting, but it's never been, nothing's more clear than when the Israel issue comes up and they just feel, they're almost unable to, do anything but kind of stammer and stutter. And, it's really just lays, the whole thing so bare about, just kind of just the fact that Israel, a country that, why would that be such a dominant country in America? And I think, I think the average person, I mean, it's, is just completely fed up with that. And so, I think, I think it's on a good trajectory. This legacy media, they're going to have to change because, my generation too, it's not even just, my generation of millennial American Jews and even the Gen Z, I mean, the support for Israel is incredibly low. So they're not even going to have support for Israel among American Jews anymore. So, I think they're in very deep trouble, and the conversation is going to shift over time to how do we, transition Israel to something healthy without them, using this nuclear weapon. That's the really scary dilemma that the world will eventually have to confront.
Do you fear that Israel at some point is going to use the nuclear weapons against someone?
Yeah, I think everyone fears that at this point, because essentially they're in a death spiral because of the mix of demographics, the state of the regional, like if they can't get this regional arrangement set up and fix their demographic situation, their economic situation.
What regional arrangement you're referring to?
So there was a plan that the Democrats and people like Brett McGurk and the very savvy kind of U.S. power, national security minds, which was to kind of bring Israel into a regional economic and security architecture with the rest of the Gulf states, building on kind of the Abraham Accords, but building it into a regional architecture, which then would be sort of part of the path of the IMEC corridor, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor.
Right.
So that was the initial plan. It was a very good plan, very smart plan. Trump, unfortunately, blew the whole plan up, didn't understand it, and ruined it.
Really?
And so,
How did that?
yeah, so because Trump doesn't understand this reason that the national security elites hated Trump is because he doesn't understand their big picture. Everyone else sort of understands kind of the broader plan, or if they don't understand it, they'll let someone who does guide their foreign policy. But the broader idea was the U.S. can't compete with China once the U.S. is bogged down in the Middle East. And so then you need Israel and the Gulf regimes with the U.S. support to kind of handle their own security. And then the U.S. can turn its attention, and then you have Europe and Ukraine bogging down Russia. And then the U.S. can turn its attention to the South China Sea, the Indo-Pacific, as they now call it. That was the concept. Trump doesn't understand any of that. Obviously, I think he doesn't understand a whole lot, right? But they still tried to resurrect it, and by having, yes.
But Trump, the first Trump administration brought Abrahamic Accord. Was that a Trump idea, or was that an Israeli idea to begin with? Because Netanyahu and the Israeli establishment have been very close with MBZ, the Mohammed bin Zayed, which is the main power, the president of the UAE. So is Abrahamic Accord originally grew between Emiratis and between the Israelis, or it was an American idea?
Yeah, that's a step in the right direction. I'm sure it was U.S. Backed, and it was with the goal of this same thing, which over time, getting this regional security architecture was the main goal. The main impediment to it was that you needed something that Israel could give to these Gulf regimes that they could claim as a win, so that their people who don't like Israel at all would say, "I can see why you're normalizing with them." The UAE is a little different because they're so unbelievably repressive, and they have such a small population that they can just keep their rich people in fear enough.
And have 1.2 million people only, 1.1 million.
Yeah. So the Saudis can't do that, or don't want to because it's too risky. And so they needed to give something. So the problem is you needed to do some sort of two-state, but the issue is you couldn't do a two-state with Hamas in Gaza. And so then, it happened to be a very funny, very useful coincidence that attack happened. Right. Apparently Israel just kind of didn't remember to guard the border that day, which was all very useful because that gave the pretext for them to do a brutal assault, try to remove Hamas, and then they wanted to install a two-state that would be kind of guided. Anyway, that was the plan as it was kind of envisioned by Brett McGurk, Jake Sullivan, and these folks, and Tony Blinken. But
something very, very big and very, very interesting. I was doing research because the 7th of October also intrigued me a lot. So I actually spent a number of hours researching. These days we have the AI apps as well. So I was looking through New York Times publications, Washington Post. There was, in fact, a few months before this, a 40-page long detailed plan that the Israeli intelligence got hold of it, which was first published by Washington Post, and also New York Times discussed it. But somehow or the other, despite the fact the plan basically said that Hamas will have an attack of this nature, the Israeli intelligence and the military thought that this attack is not going to happen, and they never did anything. That's very surprising.
Yeah, for me, it's one of the top two, probably top two most important borders to secure in the world, arguably. So for me, if anyone can get through that border, I would just say whoever is responsible for guarding the border is totally at fault. That's literally the most important border job in the world. So it's incredible that they did not manage to guard the border. And then that just coincidentally happened to be exactly the thing that helped give a pretext to remove Hamas. It's probably just a coincidence, but it is an incredibly fortunate one because of what they wanted to happen. But then again, like we said, Trump came around, didn't understand it. Kushner, tried to work with the Gulf regimes. He's close with them to try to get Trump to understand it. But Trump was never able to break with Netanyahu in the way the Gulf regimes needed him to do. They needed Netanyahu to kind of be pushed aside, cast aside, and then, so that they could say, look, Trump, Netanyahu has been humbled. He's been, removed from power. Now they're going to create a two-state that, we're going to be involved in the reconstruction of it. So this is why we can, do normalization. But it wasn't able to happen. And so then as a result, there was no regional security architecture that could contain Iran easily. And then that's what pushed Israel to say, we need to do this now. We need to take down Iran now because we don't have the trust in the regional security architecture that we need to be able to contain them successfully.
Saying something very intriguing. In the first instance, let me come back and dissect it. You said that Trump didn't understand. I mean, they wanted Trump to understand. Jared Kushner wanted Trump to understand. What Trump didn't understand, what Jared Kushner wanted him to understand?
Well, I think it's not just Jared. I mean, Marco's very much in on it as well. Marco's very sophisticated, national security kind of global strategist. Believe it or not, we've all learned that. But what he doesn't understand is that kind of the way that these U.S. elites, national security elites, think about the world, and what they think is you essentially have to go one by one, take down these remaining threats to U.S. hegemony. And Trump doesn't even see Russia that way. And as we saw from his engagement with China, he doesn't see it that way with China either. So that is exact opposite of how everyone in Washington thinks. The complete consensus in this place I'm at right now is that you must weaken China, you must weaken or overthrow Russia, and you must weaken China and maintain U.S. dominance in the Pacific and around the entire world.
I'm hearing something totally new. I mean, weakening Russia. I mean, like weakening Russia how? I mean, through the Ukraine war? I mean, you're doing something else? I mean, how?
Well, but first they do sanctions. They did sanctions. They've obviously supported a number of, different protest movements. Hillary Clinton was very vocally in support of some of the Russian protest movements, which really infuriated Putin. But no, the idea is you keep them bogged down in this war.
So creating protest movements inside Russia, different parts of Russia.
Oh yeah, that's pretty well documented that the U.S. was connected to some of those major protest movements. Hillary Clinton was specifically vocal. But it's not just Russia. I mean, it's the Russia-China alliance, which the U.S. is very worried about it because it's essentially by far the strongest such alliance in the history of ever since the U.S. and Europe kind of dominated the planet. Especially Europe and then the U.S. So they're very worried about it. And, they never explain to the American people why it's so important for the U.S. to dominate the planet. They never really attempt to explain that. It's just kind of assumed. Because I think for most Americans, there's absolutely no reason why we want to have 1,000 military bases. Why we need to maintain dominance in the South China Sea. Why we need to defend the Philippines, territorial claims, in the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea. Like, there's not 1 in 1,000 Americans who cares about that. But in DC, it's just about everybody who works in the space believes that that's, one of the most critical issues that they could ever imagine.
Could the fear be the way the Western imperialism controlled the rest of the world? If the rest of the world is allowed to become strong like China, Russia, India, they will then come and dominate us. Could this be the fear?
Yeah, I mean, it is some sort of paranoid fear like that. I mean, it always reminds me, of when you see an animal in the wild, it's like, well, it's more scared of you than you are of it. It's the same thing here where the U.S. is so fearful, it doesn't realize that. Same with Israel, right? Israel is the extreme example of this, where they're so fearful of their enemy that they've become evil and sick in crushing that fear. They've gone so far over the, off the deep end of saying, we need to protect ourselves, so we're going to become, genocidal war criminals. And the U.S. has a similar dynamic there where they just can't picture that maybe China, won't try to dominate us. Like maybe, they just can't envision a world where everyone trades and does business. You can kind of have peace deals over time that reduce nuclear stocks, reduce weapons spending, focus more on cooperation. The U.S. just can't believe, for some reason, these thinkers just can't believe that that's real. And I think there's no small part of it that all the think tanks are funded by the arms, by the arms manufacturers. So that's probably a good part of why, it's so hard to shake that, because it's not a rational thought that anyone intelligent really believes. But in this think tank world that's funded by those arms manufacturers, which is of course it's over $1 trillion a year now, plus the Intel spending and so on. So that's, I think, why they're paid to think that, but it is definitely the mainstream thinking here.
A few moments earlier, you said that the goal was to get rid of Hamas. But if you get rid of Hamas as an organization, which in fact is very difficult because Hamas is very deeply embedded into the psyche and the body politics of the Palestinian people in Gaza. But if you get rid of the Hamas, you break the back of that organization, you still have 2 million Palestinians there in Gaza, and you have almost close to another 1.67 million Palestinians in the West Bank. What do you do with them? The two-state solution is dead. Do you incorporate them in one single Israeli state, just like Edward Said and the others had been saying? What's the future of them?
Well, the plan to get rid of Hamas previously, like what Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken were pushing, was that they were going to weaken Hamas, let Netanyahu do one pass to kind of do one brutal attempt at demilitarizing. Then they were going to do a mix of aid. They were going to kind of dangle aid and reconstruction plans kind of over the Palestinians to try to see if they could like pull people away from Hamas, isolate Hamas. That was the strategy, which I could go into more depth on, but that's not going to work now. So now there is no plan at all. There's no plan at all. That's why Israel is there's no coherent plan. And I think everyone in Washington right now is scrambling to figure out what to do, but they weren't able to keep scrambling because it moved so quickly to the Iran war. But, I think it seems like we're going to be, for the, time being, we're going to be in this sort of status quo, but it's where Israel continues to be in a death spiral because, the more productive kind of relatively liberal-minded Israelis, which is, of course, relative, but they're moving to Europe, they're moving to the US, they don't like being there. I've traveled around the world just on vacation here and there. You see so many young Israelis all over the world. They don't like being there. They go home, see their family, and they get back out to the Europe or the US or whatever. So, and then the ones who are procreating in Israel among the Jews are the ultra-Orthodox who don't work and they don't serve in the army. So, and there's other issues too. But Israel is very much in a death spiral, which is why you see Netanyahu panicking. So then the question is going to come down to young Americans, Americans of all ages, but particularly younger Americans, young American Jews who are are fed up with Israel, apartheid Israel. And I think we're just going to be that process of turning the screws on it little by little until they accept that, you got to have something close to one person, one vote, in the 21st century.
One person, one vote. So basically, since I was trying to come to this, that Netanyahu himself has totally strangulated and crushed the very concept of the two-state solution, right? He doesn't believe in the two-state solution. So What he does believe then? He believes in a one-state solution with an apartheid against the Palestinians, or ultimately we're going to move towards one man, one vote.
No, they want to push them out. They want to push them out. Of course, it's
where?
Oh, they pushed them into Jordan, into Egypt.
But Jordan is not prepared to take any more Palestinians.
Well, yeah, but he doesn't, Netanyahu's not concerned about that. But that's eventually his goal, or just terrorize them and torture them enough that they self-deport. That's part of his vision. He doesn't care at all. He's not concerned with that. He's in a delusional state where he believes that, he can just keep getting away with this. And so far he has been able to. So you can sort of see why he thinks that. But
he doesn't believe in a two-state solution. He doesn't believe in a one-state solution. He just believes in a Jewish state, a Jewish society, minus the Palestinians.
Yeah, they don't even believe Palestinians are real people. So it's, it's as dark as it gets. But unfortunately for him, he's so extreme that he's sealed the fate of his so-called country. And it's just amazing. There was another path. The sooner that Israeli, power brokers could have taken that path, if it was decades ago or years ago, the sooner they could have taken it, the better. But now they've almost killed, the real. There were ways to do it, but they've killed it now, and it's very hard to envision how Israel survives long term. Based on the current state of play. And so it's just ironic that Netanyahu who did that. Jeffrey Sachs, just recently recounted that he was saying to, I believe, the, Israeli UN ambassador, that you're committing suicide, you're committing, that your policies are suicidal for your own country. And it's really true. So, I think some of us young American Jews, our hope is, you can usher this into a healthier situation where, we could go to an Israel that's multi-ethnic, truly. I mean, that would really be a beautiful thing, where there's still Jews there, but everyone's living, working together, putting the wounds of the past, behind them. I think that's the dream. And I think, given the U.S. leverage over Israel.
So what do you think? I mean, if Netanyahu wants to live in a community of the GCC countries and wants to do trade with them, with Israeli businesses setting up shops in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Qatar and Bahrain and Oman and Saudi Arabia and everywhere, what is his problem with the Palestinians then? I mean, if he is prepared to embrace the Arabs and Arabs are prepared to embrace him, then why not the Palestinians, that are the Arabs, to basically give them a citizenship status and have a one-state solution?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's, fundamentally, it wouldn't be a Jewish state if you have them in there, because they have a bigger population. So they would elect Palestinian leaders, and then you wouldn't have a Jewish state, which is something that he, for some reason, thinks is incredibly important. I live in Brooklyn.
Why you need a Jewish state when you can have a democratic Jewish Palestinian Christian state? I mean, if it is a democratic state, then Arabs from other parts of the world can also come and live there. I mean, Christians can live in there, Muslims can live in there, Indians can live in there. Why not have a democratic state?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's some fear and some historical trauma about whether Jews will be safe. But nowadays, Jews are very safe in the United States. I live in Brooklyn, I'm back and forth. There's a Jewish community here in DC as well. Milwaukee, where I grew up, great Jewish community. And Jews are safer in all those communities than they are in Israel, for sure. So it makes no sense. And I think young Jews don't see any need for it. We'd much rather have a multi-ethnic, Palestine, or, area, whatever, Palestine is presumably.
A normal society.
But, there's so much, this Israeli population has just gone through so many decades of brutalizing their neighbors. You do wonder, whether there's a little bit of a collective, just a collective sickness that's kind of, taken hold there. And it's really, it's scary. It's scary to see it, sad to see it. But, I think if the U.S. stops, starts to close that endless weapons supply, you could start to see Israelis realize, well, I don't have the same options I did. I'm going to need to rethink my approach. Or they could think, I'm not safe here. I'm going to move. And then maybe the Jews that remain are the ones that, get along with their neighbors. That would be, from my perspective, the ideal. But this is all way off into the future. But the key thing now is that we've reduced, from our perspective, we've reduced the amount of people that the U.S.-Israeli war machine can kill. And right now, their sights are aimed on Iranian people and Lebanese people, in addition to Gazans. It's just horrific. So, again, we're pushing to get Democrats to, in good faith, help this, very troubled, extremely senior man get out of this. Don't try to score political points on how stupid he is or how crazy he is. We know he's stupid and crazy. That's why this is such a scary moment. So that's why we're, people have been fantastic on it. People like Ro Khanna, has always been good at being fair-minded when it comes to, being nonpartisan in foreign policy. And so that's why he was able to work with Thomas Massie, who's been our other longtime champion. So, I will say, those are two great politicians to support. Your audience may know Ro Khanna has been one of the leading voices on Pakistan as well. And I think, really speaking out for Imran Khan and political prisoners against the U.S.-backed regime. So, and again, he's a younger member, and we're getting more younger members too. So, I think the general trajectory is positive. It's incredibly dark and horrific time in Pakistan, in Iran, in Lebanon, but I think the trajectory is overall positive. I think there's reason for hope. And
you said many times the overall trajectory is positive, but I, coming as a fresh, sort of would-be American resident, I see that Congress has lost all power to curtail the president. The way the founding fathers in 18th century had thought of United States, they never thought United States would be superpower. So they were not much worried about the presidential powers. They were more worried about the local rights, and there was a neatly balanced system. But somehow the other, with the United States becoming a superpower in 20th century, the office of the president has become very powerful versus the states, the governors. The Supreme Court has been giving more and more power to the federal government with the rise of the FBI, the CIA. The president is now is almost like a monarch. I mean, there is a point to the no king movement. So the president has become a sort of a king. I mean, he's like a monarch and a king. So that doesn't look very positive to me.
Yeah, to be clear, I mean, the situation in the United States is not positive at the moment. I mean, it's obviously, Trump is one of the more, problematic, unwell heads of state of a major country in history, arguably. But, but more broadly, I think that from the way that the trend lines are going for millennials, for Gen Z, what we are looking for, the types of politicians that are coming up, we're seeing more and more independent politicians that are not, coming out of that same traditional Democratic Party kind of apparatus. Like Graham Plattner is a really impressive one, been incredible on anti-war stuff. He's an Iraq War veteran, but he's really staunchly anti-war, very independent-minded, taking zero money from AIPAC, and he's very likely to win, become a next senator. So, and then the way the independent media is growing, I think that we have a very scary moment here. We need to get through this. We need to reduce how many people are killed. But I think it's very possible that we go from this to the type of what we call maybe, sort of a Europe, towards that European social democratic model, because Americans are exhausted. Working class Americans are exhausted. Obviously, poor Americans are barely even surviving. And even upper middle class Americans are not that comfortable because life has just become so expensive, so challenging. You'd have no safety net if something goes wrong. College can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you have a medical issue, you didn't pick the right insurance, you could be deep in debt. People are exhausted. So in that sense, I do think there's a high chance that we can transition from this Trump years to something genuinely, closer to a European social democrat, like along the lines of Bernie Sanders. I think it's possible.
Just a few more minutes of winding down this discussion. That you have been worried about the Iran war. You have been worried about Venezuela as well. I mean, you could see things coming because you deal with the subject matter. But on every instance, the Congress has not been able to curtail the presidency. Like the Ro Khanna and Thomas Macy were trying to, probably for the past several months. I mean, it was not only in January. They were trying for months and months onward. They could see the war coming. The public has been made to believe this thing that war just happened because the talks failed in Geneva. But people like Ro Khanna and Thomas Macy and many others like yourself could see the war coming for the past several months. In fact, I was reading a piece that said that even Dan Kane, is it unprecedented that the 3-star general has been brought back from retirement, made into a 4-star general after retirement in February 2025. And that was not normal. In the history of the Office of the Joint Chiefs, no Joint Chiefs has been, appointed like this way. So they wanted to bring a man who is indebted to president, and they wanted to bring a man who's weak. And that has something to do with what we are seeing right now, that because whenever a plan like this on Middle East, on Iran was presented, the Joint Chiefs opposed it. I mean, I've been reading this as well. But this time, the whole thing was planned. But the Congress couldn't stop it. This is a war which has not been called a war. It is being called an operation. The whole world has shaken. The whole world is disturbed. There have been energy shortages in South Korea and Philippines, and countries. But the whole world has been shaken. It is not being called a war. The Congress has not been consulted. It is a huge shock to the Congress, but Congress is not able to stop the war.
Well, on that front, I have maybe some bad news, which is that part of the reason Congress hasn't been able to stop the war is that a huge percentage of Congress does not want to stop the war. So the Republicans are obviously they're explicitly supporting the war. But the really bad news, and this has been covered by DropSite and other outlets like Ida Chavez wrote a good piece, because of the way that, vast majority of Democrats, so let's say they think war, Democrats certainly agree war, it can be really dangerous, really unhelpful. But none of these Democrats believe, hey, Iran is really not our business. We should let them develop in peace and just, make deals with them, but, leave them alone. Even if people do oppose war, they do still buy into the framework that we should be in the business of overthrowing Iran. The reason that they haven't done it is because it's so incredibly unpopular that no president was essentially dumb enough or suicidal enough politically to want to do it. So that was where an idea came essentially, which is let's make Trump do this. And if you followed it closely, it was very easy to see that Republicans were they were obsessively trying to trap him into it. And these are Republicans, by the way, that most of them did not like Trump. Most of them thought he was a traitor for being close to Putin, but they've come around. So they want to trap him into it because they don't care about his legacy. They want to use him to get this thing done that no one else wants to do. And then the same thing sort of applies to Democrats, but they have even more incentive because if Trump does this war, everybody knew. It's what we said. It's what everybody knows. It was a political disaster. And it already has been. It's only 4 weeks in or so. So you saw a bunch of Democrats, and this is the space that I was working in, which was really a very frustrating space, which is you would see Democrats oppose the war, but they would do it in a way that if you study this stuff in Congress, you could tell they were not really trying to stop it. They were trying to signal that they opposed it, but without actually creating any resistance. And so that's the space, and we're still in that space today. Because believe it or not, these 85, 90, 95% of Democrats who are funded by pro-Israel groups, they want Trump to destroy Iran, to take this problem off the chessboard for the next president.
Why it's a problem? I mean, why these
in their mind?
In their minds, why in their minds, in the Democrats' minds or anyone's mind, Iran is a problem for the United States? Why?
But we'd have to go back into the, into the 79, to the whole Mossadegh coup, and we could go back into that thinking, but it is obviously an extension of kind of colonial, neo-colonial thinking when you go back that far. But more recently, it was Iran was seen as overperforming in the 12-Day War, and that is the thing that led, I think, virtually everyone in the national security consensus in Washington to say, you cannot let Iran take its knowledge from the 12-Day War and then build its missile and drone capacity around, that knowledge, because they did so well, then gained so much knowledge. If they were going to be able to rebuild their missile and drone capacity and then restock their, what in Washington they call the Iranian proxies, you may have heard that term. It just means like people in the Middle East who really don't like Israel and want to work with Iran to oppose them. That's what an Iranian proxy is. So in Iraq, they're Iraqis. Anyway, I'm sure your viewers understand it. But in Washington, we just say it's an Iranian-backed proxy, which just means that they don't have any independent thoughts or actions. But if Iran was allowed to restock all those groups, I think the general sense is that Israel would have no choice but to essentially, do diplomacy with them and come to a mutual understanding. And that's not acceptable for Washington. Yeah.
So Israel coming to an accommodation with its neighbors, the way history, every power had to do. After all, Rome and Persia existed with each other they fought and then they had treaties. They fought and they had treaties, So they don't want Israel to have a normal relationship with its enemies, opponents, and neighbors. This is one point.
Yeah, I mean, they might not even think of it that they might not even go that deep. They just say we can't allow Iran and the proxies to have a deterrent, that would make Israel, would reduce Israel's edge over all of them. Israel has to have dominance over. They don't even think about it that far. They just say you can't allow anyone to be on the same, level as Israel militarily.
But now we're coming to a very difficult point, impasse. If this is where the problem has reached, then no nuclear is not an issue at all. I mean, right now, what Trump actually needs from Iran is that Iran somehow commits that it's not going to develop its missile programs. But how can Iran agree to not develop the missile program? But the only leverage they had in the last 20 days or 30 days is the missile program. I mean, if the world is talking to them, if they're holding on the Strait of Hormuz, if they have some iota, an element, an atom of self-respect left in them, and autonomy, it is because of the missile programs and the Shahed drones. So they would not be ready to compromise on that. So here we strike a brick wall.
Yeah, well, they were never willing to compromise on that, and they never will.
And they never should. Logically speaking, they should never compromise.
Yeah, unless they want to not exist soon, because that's Israel obviously would eliminate them. And so that was always the whole goal of the nuclear program, the goal of the ballistic missile. Anyone saying those things have to be gone, it's not a good faith argument. What it means is, we need to be able to regime change you. And so we need you to, disarm so we can regime change you. That's what it means, for anyone fair. So yeah, there's no solution. That's why this is such a strategic blunder. This is why Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, Brett McGurk, they had a much smarter plan. I was impressed. I thought it was a kind of evil genius plan. Trump wasn't able to do it. Now he's locked in a war with Iran that if he doesn't make a deal that is effectively amounts to surrender, then he's going to destroy the global economy and destroy his presidency. And so all I have to say is we need him to make that deal, get out of this war, and it'll be okay.
What is that the Pakistani generals, in order to please Trump, in order to please and curry favor with the Trump, will try to persuade the Iranians on these kind of impossible demands from Donald Trump and the Zionists that give up your missile program. You shouldn't really have the Shahid drones, and Iranians cannot agree on this. And then they were, after 5 days, on Friday, they would again be putting the blame on the Iranians, and Trump will basically say that, unfortunately, I'm again starting the campaign because Iranians have not agreed. And we also hear about the 5,000 or 3,000 Marines and 6,500 Marines heading the Persian Gulf, and 3,000 expeditionary force, which is shipped to beach specialized Marine trains for Kharg Island. What about that? Why are they going there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's a very important distinction we can make, which is there are a significant number, well, a very small number, but significant, of Republicans in Congress who over the past week have been attacking Lindsey Graham viciously for having suggested that we might send ground troops. And it's been a pretty heated battle. So, these are the types of Republicans who are somewhat closer to the Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene type wing. And so there are Republicans in the House and Senate. Senator Hawley is sort of in that kind of lane. He's said no ground troops previously. So there is a constituency in the Republican Party for no ground troops, even here in Washington. So that is one thing that Trump, has to be aware of, and is certainly aware of, which is that if he sends those troops, he's likely to lose the votes in Congress that we've been pushing for. And if he loses those votes, well, yeah, then we have a real chance to take him to court and stop the war as well. So, I think he's going to be really reluctant to do that. Obviously, his advisors, many of them are pushing for him to do that. I just saw MSNBC, like I said, supposedly a Democratic aligned station. Their commentators were saying he's going to have to do that. So that's certainly what Washington wants and thinks needs to be done, which is, again, why they want Donald Trump to have to do it, so that he will take all the popularity hit, and all of the other people in Washington can say, we didn't support that. That was just Donald Trump, even while getting the benefit of the war that they've wanted for decades.
Yeah, I heard Ramsey Clark, I think the former NATO Supreme Commander.
Wesley Clark, I'm sorry. Yeah, I saw that same horrible clip. Ramsey Clark was a better guy, actually. But I saw that horrible Wesley Clark clip. I'll post it because it was really horrific.
I wasn't expecting him to say this thing. He almost basically said that the ground forces are important to open the Strait of Hormuz. I didn't understand.
And there's no pushback. So again, this just speaks to why, again, Pakistan, you guys were ahead of the curve. Independent media, it's the bare minimum we need in this world. So thank God for Pakistan, you and your other, the other journalists who've been accused so horrifically.
All are living in exile, by the way, Eric. All of these you're referring to are living in Canada, United States, UK, Australia. None of them is in Pakistan.
Yeah, it's amazing. But that's the way, and thankfully it's going to spread here, because it's just incredible to see what these so-called progressive TV channels are saying, just pushing extreme pro-war propaganda. But again, I think we're going to win. We got to get out of this one. And then I think there's a consensus in this country on the right, on the left. We don't want to be involved over there. We're not qualified to be involved over there. So let's focus here.
If you refer to the media, I saw a clip, if I correctly remember the name, Julian Assange, the founder of the WikiLeaks, right, who suffered a lot. And he was actually making an observation that all wars happen because of the media, because people do not like wars to happen, because they're affected by the wars. But media sells the war and creates a very acceptability for the wars in such a way. So when I asked you the question of why these Democrats want to get rid of the Iran government, I think the actual reason is this, that the media in this country have trained their minds in such a way over the past 50 years that they see Iran just like, Muslims see blasphemy or, something against Quran. They see Iran as some sort of red herring. It's almost become a religious issue in their minds that Iran is a threat. I mean, you cannot go anywhere in this country in a seminar and you have to start by saying that Iranian regime is cruel. They've killed 60,000 people, but this war should not really happen, So you can't really see the truth that they haven't really killed 60,000 people. I mean, these protests happened because Israel was sponsoring the protests and Mossad. You can't say these kind of things, even if you're against the war. So it's media are responsible for creating the wars.
Absolutely. And they're all, corporations, part of conglomerates that are connected to the defense industry. So it's a very disturbing system. It's not, it's not as, like in a place like Pakistan, it's a little more basic. You'd have ISI like really curating the media. Here it's really the incentives that do a good part of it. The classic work on that is Noam Chomsky's, manufacturing consent. That's the basic framework. Once you read that, you could fully understand even just the basic structure he lays out in the early part of the book. Or even read a summary of it. They explain how the incentives work, and that also applies to Washington. How politicians get self-selected, how the system selects for these politicians. How the system selects for the nonprofit organizations. It's not rewarding the most accurate moral thought. It's rewarding the thing that best serves, these interests. And so that's what we're going up against. But thankfully, the system does not appear to have a lot of runway left. It just is really not functioning for anyone. But for those of us who are in the social justice movement, who want to see a decent, normal country, I think we're going to win soon. We got to run through the finish line. We got to work hard because,
One aspect, before you get very optimistic, one aspect we have missed. When Trump said that we are talking, we had a proposal, or Iranians have approached us, Netanyahu issued a video statement in which he said that he spoke with his counterpart. He referred to the US president as his counterpart, and his counterpart thinks that because of the military achievements, he thinks negotiation can yield with Iran. And then he says, we are continuing with our campaign against Iran, nuclear Iran, and against Lebanon, right? Which is now the seventh invasion of Lebanon. So even if the Trump wants to strike a deal, say, with Iranians, I mean, hypothetically, what would Netanyahu do?
Well, that gets back to the original question of how was it that the U.S.-Israel lobby was able to trap Trump into this in the first place? But let's put aside, the possibility for now that they have something on him and can control him. I think, there is a challenge even for Israel, which is that if this thing escalates and destroys the global economy, that's not necessarily going to be that good for Israel either. So I think they are looking for a way to, like I saw some proposal today talking about a 30-day ceasefire as we do negotiations. They're trying to find any way they can to get Iran to pause this, even though Iran is currently at the peak of its leverage. So, I think they're scrambling for ideas. Netanyahu is trying to position himself to be able to influence it. But, I think the basic dynamic is clear that, they're not able to achieve their goals militarily. Iran has immense leverage now, having shut down the Strait of Hormuz and having shown what it can do to threaten, all the infrastructure of the Gulf. And they don't have a solution for it. And so, I think that's going to be the fundamental problem until it escalates into a years-long global economic crisis, or until, people help Trump to escape from this nightmare. And so that's the work that we're in right now. And that's why we're pushing right now for House votes. The House hasn't voted on the war powers in 3 weeks. And Democrats could force this vote, but they haven't. And it's because there are a lot of people in Washington that do not want to help Trump get out of this.
But they want 2 votes, one in House and one in the Senate.
Yeah, so there was a vote 3 weeks ago in the House, right at the start of the war. We were really involved in supporting that effort. It wasn't an effort that came out of Dem leadership. It came out of, as you know, Ro Khanna, Thomas Massie. But now for 3 weeks, as the conflict has deteriorated, they haven't held one additional vote in the House. And the House is really where the action is, because the members are way more accountable to the voters because they're up for election every 2 years. So every member of the House is coming up for election shortly. And the Senate is much less accountable because it's only a third of it goes up every 2 years, it's a 6-year term. So the Senate is much easier to control for the national security establishment. The House is much tougher because people have to be more responsive to the overwhelming opposition to the war. So that's why, yes.
Very interesting point. Very interesting distinction between the Senate and the House.
Yeah. So that's why we've seen a bunch of votes in the Senate. We just had one today. They keep doing failed votes over and over. Why would they do that? I mean, I'm happy they're taking the votes, but they're not winning. So it's interesting. The place where we could win in the House, they're not having votes. And the place where we're not going to win in the Senate is where they are. So you can see this is an example of potentially the type of opposition to the war that is not actually structured to end it. So my group, we're saying we need a vote in the House because we are just one vote shy at most of passing it. And if we pass it, that gives Trump a little space to say, look, Congress wants me to make a deal. I'm going to make a deal. And so that's what we're doing, putting partisanship aside. And American rich people, upper class people love their partisan politics. Regular Americans hate it. But so these people love their partisan politics. We're saying, put that aside. The world is about to be destroyed. Let's try to help Trump get out of this. And then once we're safe and it's over, we can talk about how much of an idiot he is again.
But Eric, in these dynamics, the Republican leadership might also be thinking that we have to bang Iran to the knees in such a way that it can help us in the midterms.
Yeah, I mean, I think, they're so, dominated by the U.S.-Israel establishment, Fox News. I mean, they're not really thinking super rationally as far as their partisan incentives. I think from their perspective, most of them are not fans of Trump. They're more traditional, the traditional establishment Republicans. So I think from their perspective, it's worth it to take a loss if Trump and his movement die, which is what will definitely happen if this war continues. Because this war will not just kill Trump, but it'll kill J.D. Vance's movement as well. And so then that would basically make Marco Rubio the guaranteed candidate. And Marco Rubio is the number one choice of the U.S. national security establishment, basically. He's an elite member of that group. And so the biggest thing that the U.S. national security elites are worried about is J.D. Vance, because he's an opponent of the NATO alliance. And the NATO alliance is one of the most sacred alliances in this town, as it is, the basis of their anti-Russia work. So, that's so I think,
I heard a new thing since you mentioned J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. The president, for the first time, said that J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio will be parts of the negotiation along with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. That's a new thing. So what's the importance of that, J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio being part of the negotiation?
Throughout the entire war, you may remember that J.D. Vance, just before the war broke out, brought the Omani foreign minister, who's been, I tweeted, this guy is the clear Nobel Peace Prize, winner. I mean, we should give it to him now. I mean, this guy's been incredible. He also played a great role in the Yemen, U.S.-Yemen ceasefire back, in the early, early last year. Which was something that we worked on and supported. And so,
Badr al-Busayri.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just think he's been phenomenal. And I think everyone thinks that globally, who's sensible. But all that to say is, J.D. Vance brought him to the U.S. He did a bunch of appearances. Him and J.D. Vance were clearly trying to head off the war. And so I think J.D. getting back involved is perhaps him being able to reassert himself within the administration now that Trump is seeing what a nightmare this is. JD is obviously, a lot of people have issues with him, but he's certainly a fully sharp guy, mentally. He went to, I think, Yale Law School, and, he's a smart guy. So it's exactly what Trump needs, because Trump is not sharp enough to manage this. So I think it's a sign that they're looking for an off-ramp. But again,
the deadlock on the war, it has increased the leverage and the space for J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. This is what has happened.
Well, J.D. and Marco, they say they're friendly, but they represent totally opposite sides of the Republican foreign policy spectrum. J.D. is very close to the Tucker type wing. He's the closest. Well, he's one of the closest senators, ever, to that wing. He's obviously the closest vice president to that in history by far. And Marco is just the most traditional. He's basically identical to Dick Cheney. There's not he's just younger and different style, but his politics are identical to Dick Cheney.
Just last question. So if Trump gets something of course, if Iranians are prepared to give in writing that they're not going to develop the nuclear weapons and all of the nuclear thing, and then there could probably be a no-war pact between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a no-war pact between whatever no-war pact Iran can offer, a no-war pact, or US can offer a no-war pact between Iran and Israel. So will Trump and his team be able to sell this to Netanyahu, the real decision maker?
Yeah, that's going to be the big question. I think it does come down to that. What does
$4,000 question? The old American language. The 64.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. I was trying to think of the right number of what is the value of the question, but the $1 trillion question. So no, but ultimately it's I think that's part of the reason why we do need Congress to act in good faith, because it will help even if Netanyahu does have some tape of Trump from the past. If Trump can say, look, it's Congress forcing my hand here, I'm going to end this war, please don't release the tape, that gives him a better chance. And so, again, anyone who cares about the world, anyone who cares about our country, about our troops, about the children in Iran, you pray to God that everyone in this country would care about slaughtering these children. It's unbelievable. Unfortunately, they don't really care that much about it, but you would pray that they would. Okay. But anyone who cares about this, we need to help Trump get out of this, take a brief pause from how much we hate this guy and how horrible he is, and just say, what can we do to help this deeply troubled old man, stop an escalation trap that he's in, so that, we can save these people. And so that's the work that we're in. We hope the Pakistani regime, one of the more incompetent regimes I've ever studied. It's hard, you have to laugh or you'll cry studying it. It's so incompetent. But you pray to God they can have, a moment where they do something good, this decade. We got to pray for that,
Once in a lifetime.
Yeah, once in a lifetime. Exactly.
Let's Eric, thank you so much. Let's stay hopeful. Let's stay hopeful that something turns out. And we should actually, again, talk about these issues with other friends as well, right?
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.